What did you expect?
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Taco Comfort Solutions.
You know, people go to scary movies to be scared. People go to comedy shows to laugh. That's why if you ever get a chance to stand up in front of a comedy audience, which I have on a number of occasions, they're already ready to laugh. So you don't have to do much. Well, what do you think people who wanted to see that Democratic debate were expecting? They were expecting a food fight, and they got it. And then the media pundits are, oh, lions and tigers and bears, oh my, oh, they're fighting each other, oh, they're on attack mode, oh, a couple of major substantial issues were missed, oh. What do you think the thing is designed for at this juncture, with too many cooks in the kitchen and a billionaire buying in? Welcome in. Now we'll get real punditry from my guests. In the meantime, here are some of the headlines, you know, the takeaways. Oh, there's so many ways to look at it. And headlines like this, Bloomberg and Sanders under attack. Well, that's one attack. There were a lot of mini skirmishes. I mean, Buttigieg and Klobuchar having their own little mini spat on the side. And I mean, the whole thing, it was like Syria. You don't know who's fighting who's wearing what uniform, and what the end game is going to be. But somehow the network tries to make sense of the whole thing.
Former New York City Mayor Mike Bloomberg was in the spotlight and under fire from fellow candidates eager to attack their latest competitor who's been rising in the polls.
I'd like to talk about who we're running against. A billionaire who calls women fat broads and horse-faced lesbians. And no, I'm not talking about Donald Trump. I'm talking about Mayor Bloomberg.
Senator Elizabeth Warren, positioned next to Bloomberg, was his toughest critic.
We have a very few non-disclosure agreements.
How many is that?
Let me finish.
How many is that?
None.
But all candidates on stage had their sights set on the former mayor and brought anticipated attacks on his stop and frisk policy.
Mr. Bloomberg had policies in New York City of stop and frisk, which went after African American and Latino people in an outrageous way.
The policy was abhorrent, and it was, in fact, a violation of every right people have.
Bloomberg, who has apologized for the failed policy, said he was embarrassed by stop and frisk and attempted to push the conversation to defeating the current president.
I can't think of ways that would make it easier for Donald Trump to get reelected than listening to this conversation.
President Trump tweeted his reaction to the debate, calling Bloomberg's performance perhaps the worst in debate history, and adding, if this doesn't knock him out of the race, nothing will. Campaign watchers also gave Bloomberg lackluster reviews.
He literally felt like a visitor on the stage last night. He didn't feel like he was a part of the party.
Despite the criticism, Bloomberg picked up new congressional endorsements after the debate. Elizabeth Warren, who had the most speaking time and most jabs at her competitors, is touting a spike in fundraising.
My two guys here. Mr. Fleming, the pollster, Mr. Nesi, who just interviewed and met Mike Bloomberg only a week or so ago. Welcome, fellas.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
What did they expect?
Yeah.
Well, what is this talking, chattering, pundit reporting class of media that's,
It's what you expected last night, Dan. I mean, you would expect nothing but that. You got Michael Bloomberg is spending all this money, who is going to really come on Super Tuesday very strong if they don't do something to stop him. And it was an effort last night by all 5 other Democrats to go after him to stop his momentum. We're going to find out in the next few days when the polls come out whether it's had any effect.
They're offended by his very existence in this campaign, and it's completely understandable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you got to put yourself in their shoes for a minute. You know, they've all been busting their butts for how many months, endlessly dialing for dollars in some cases, going all over creation, night after night in Iowa and New Hampshire, thank voters, just, all this. And he swoops in November, skips all the debates they did last year, skips the early states, and just says, I can buy my way into competition. So far, he's right? There's a reason he was on the debate stage last night. The money has really given him a surge with some voters. But I think there was a personal frustration and animosity there you could just feel.
We are at a really weird place. I mean, it's like that's not the first time I've said that, and you've said that, or it's only about the 1 millionth time we've said that in the last 3 years. But one of the weird places is in this particular context, not unlike all of this gray area constitutionally with Donald Trump's behavior and Congress's reaction to it. We have this like unaddressed, very strange, uncomfortable, but legal matter of spending money to run in a race of this kind. And we've seen it in Rhode Island when the Donkocheris of the world write their own ticket for the most part. The Link Chafees of the world at least could seed Governor Raimondo to a certain level can seed her campaign with hundreds of thousands, if not a 7-figure check. But this thing is so astronomical, it makes you wonder, even if you're a free market capitalist and a First Amendment advocate, should there be a cap on your presidential resource for a race?
I was thinking about the same thing actually yesterday, Dan, about comparing it to self-funding or heavily funded governor candidates we've had in Rhode Island in recent cycles. And Governor Raimondo raised all that money, but she still had massively more money because she campaign fundraised for it. Link Chafee, I think it was $1.6 million he put into that campaign in 2010. Donkocheri put his own money behind it.
Well, Gina has the money. I don't remember what she seeded her campaign with early on as treasurer.
She never did.
Never put any.
She once put, I want to say, 30 or 50 grand in when they were.
Okay, so take her out of the equation, because
I wouldn't actually though, because I think Gina Raimondo is in a different category of her own, because she's not. She can fundraise to such an outsized degree for Rhode Island that it is unusual. So it's like a self-funder who can just write a check. She just works really hard to get that money all over the country.
For financial network connections.
Exactly.
Okay.
But the other difference to me between them and Bloomberg is Mike Bloomberg, they also played by the rules of the game. Kocheri, Chafee, they got into the election in a normal time frame. They participated in all the debates. They didn't skip. I think it's also Bloomberg's sort of almost lackadaisical feeling like, oh, waiting months and months, and then November, all right, I'm going to ramp up a massive campaign and I can buy my way into this without doing all the other stuff.
So do the deadlines, Joe, get moved backward in a calendar from state to state to enter into primaries? Remember, he set this thing up so he could make the deadlines for Super Tuesday. Right. Should it be a year in advance for a primary? Is that the way? At least you mitigate what Ted's talking about?
That may be too far out, a year in advance. But I think they may do some adjusting of the dates of the primary so this doesn't happen again. But at the same time,
registering for the
right at the very last
competitive.
Yeah. But at the same time, what Bloomberg did was he waited to see what the field was, and he decided this field is not a strong field. I can go in there and I can defeat this field. However, the first 4 primaries is too late, because they've already done all their homework in their field, in those states, and I can't cut that. I can go to Super Tuesday, where no one's really looking at yet, spend a lot of money, and make a strong impact. So, I mean, he had a plan. It's just that he's really using it very effectively in the media.
If I'm a moderate Democrat, though, I am panicked at this point.
Right.
Because they are, you actually further splitting the moderate wing of the party at this point, with Bloomberg now arriving on the scene, as Bernie Sanders only seems to go stronger, even in places like South Carolina, where he wasn't supposed to be that strong.
Right.
I mean, I would be, if I want to be anyone right now, I absolutely want to be the Sanders campaign.
Sanders is running even in South Carolina with Joe Biden at this point. And it's because the moderate vote, Ted's right, the moderate vote's getting split up so many ways. And you're going to find Super Tuesday, California right now, he has like almost a 2-to-1 lead on one of the polls. If he keeps that lead, he's going to get an awful lot of delegates. So the Democrats need to close that. And as long as there's 4 strong moderates in the race, it's not going to happen.
Well, I think South Carolina will be the line of demarcation for Joe Biden.
Yes.
And he'll pull out.
But not till after Super Tuesday, because it's only 3 days later.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But
unless
I think he might. I think he might. I don't think he wants to suffer a Super Tuesday deluge against him. He might be. Obviously, he'll be on the ballots, but an announcement that he's out of the game might dilute, fix part of the problem. I don't see. I don't see anybody else getting out of this thing, and I see them stupid enough to run this thing out so that Sanders has such a delegate lead that he has a great chance to get his 50.1% of the delegates. thus ruling out superdelegate influence, thus having the nomination.
It reminds me so much every day more of the 2016 Republican presidential primary, where nobody wanted to lay a glove on Donald Trump, even though he was the front runner, because they said he's so unusual, he'll collapse, we got to fight amongst ourselves, I don't want to get his supporters mad. It's the exact same phenomenon.
Yeah, but in this particular case, Sanders is a proven entity. He's got a base,
but you know what I mean. Think about it. Last night, Elizabeth Warren, she really took a bite out of Mike Bloomberg. Great, except she is running well behind the actual front runner, who is Bernie Sanders. Now, it may, with the time left, she may feel, well, at least she raised all that money last night off her performance. Maybe they think, okay, we use Bloomberg as a foil, and then we can get somewhere. But in the end, the person to beat right now is Bernie Sanders, and I don't see anyone really going at him.
And Bernie has a base of 25 to 30%. And with the field the way it is, he's strong. And I agree. Joe Biden, if he doesn't win South Carolina, he's basically done. The other one is Amy Klobuchar to watch. She's not doing well in Nevada right now. She's not doing well in South Carolina. I'm not sure where she's going to do well on Super Tuesday. She could be in trouble as far as having money after Super Tuesday to keep going.
And when we come back, we'll talk about her and Buttigieg, because they had their own little side battle, which...
He may not be her VP pick.
No, stay with us.
I've been told many times to wait my turn and to step aside. And I'm not going to do that now, and I'm not going to do that because a campaign memo from Mayor Bloomberg said this morning that the only way that we get a nominee is if we step aside for him. I think we need something different than Donald Trump. I don't think you look at Donald Trump and say we need someone richer in the White House.
I'm a New Yorker. I know how to take on an arrogant con man like Donald Trump that comes from New York.
Yeah, probably. But if you thought that you were getting some pizzazz or some warm fuzzy or a teddy bear in Michael Bloomberg, you were sadly mistaken. I'm not shocked. I'm a little surprised that he wasn't more prepared for the attacks that he was going to get. But for the most part, he'll have answers by the next debate. They're not going to be sufficient. It's just going to be one of those things where I think it's a checkmate, because if we're talking about character issues, Donald Trump's not going to advance in that category.
No.
So it's kind of a zero-sum game, seems to me. Amy Klobuchar started to lose her marbles a little bit at the end, because I think she felt like she was short-shrifted, and getting attacked by Buttigieg, it just felt useless to me as a viewer. Like, guys, will you stop it? So I don't think it's, he did a good job for 60% of that debate, and then he started to sound like a high school brat, I thought, and that's what she was more or less saying to him. But I thought that if they could make it to a brokered convention, that she's the one that could end up the beneficiary. Because I think she would torture Donald Trump. I think he'd have a hard time with her, and she is in the middle. She's not on the left.
Right.
But I don't know how she gets there, Joe.
No, as I said, I don't see a path at this point.
Well, only if Bernie doesn't have the delegate lead.
Right.
If he's got 49% or less, and she's still hanging around,
right,
she could be the brokered choice.
It's just so hard for me to imagine.
Yeah,
the blood on the floor at the Democratic convention if Bernie's at 48%, and someone else comes out.
No, if Bernie's at 49%, I think he'll get the nomination. He'll cut some deal with one of the other candidates to get the votes he needs. If he's at 30 or 35%, then I can see it being broken.
And look, another lesson we learned from Donald Trump is the people are so tribal now in politics that those party nominations are extremely valuable currency. And you lock in usually at least 40, if not 45% of the entire electorate the second you are the person with the D or the R next to your name. So then it's just it would presumably just be this terse warfare battle between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, both of whom are very unorthodox historically from who ran for president in the United States in those swing states.
And it's going to come down to those swing states, as Ted said. 6 or 7 states is where the election is going to be decided. Most of the other states, we know how they're voting already. There isn't going to be much difference.
That's a good point. But even before last night's debate, I think, 70,000 votes had been cast early in Nevada.
Yeah.
And California's had hundreds of thousands, if not millions of votes cast already. We almost can't keep up. The system is changing each election, it feels like so much. I almost can't keep up because it doesn't look like last time.
Well, and I think the biggest system change, in addition to those important points, is that the superdelegates can't weigh in.
Right.
Agreed.
and they're not engaged. And by the way, I talked to a couple of very smart people, friends of mine today, who asked me questions about this, who have no idea how the convention works, don't even know what brokered means, have no idea what a superdelegate is, they have no idea what the play is and what the change has been since 2016. This is a private organization, the Democratic Party. It runs its campaigns the way it wants to, but if it sticks to its own rules right now, there might be no stopping the inevitable Bernie Sanders nomination.
That's a possibility.
And that is congratulations, Donald Trump, on a second term. Pollster?
I would think, looking at this as a pollster, I would think Donald Trump, if he's running against Bernie Sanders, is going to use a socialist issue and really push that in those swing states big time. And I think that will move some of those voters over to Donald Trump in those states, that he's going to take away everything
and
that you
Bernie's
want.
doing what he can to try to describe the country currently as a socialist. You know, Social Security, Medicare already, you know, Medicaid, these are already social programs. But the moniker, the brand, the way people think, the lack of civics, understanding, and his lack of even a dollar amount for Medicare for all, I think is a sinking ship in that, you're right, 10% swing of the grabbable vote out there.
Well, you know, one thing with Sanders, he talks a lot about Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, and the New Deal. But FDR was very clear he was not a socialist, right? He didn't use that branding at a time when socialism was looking, before, you know, the communist countries had collapsed and it really had some bad branding. And so he tries to say that New Deal programs from the 30s are socialism, and therefore that's what I'm talking about. But, you know, if he really wants to emulate FDR, that kind of language was not how those programs were sold, you know, 90 years ago, 80 years ago. And so I think you know, if Bernie Sanders is a nominee, it's going to be a very interesting political science test of when you introduce a new contested concept into the electorate. Also, don't forget, he will be older than Donald Trump. He just had the heart attack. He's not putting out his medical records.
You know, I look at this thing, in all due respect to, you know, I'm not getting any younger either. Right, Joe? We're not getting any younger.
Getting older.
But I'm thinking about, here's a 78-year-old guy and a 78-year-old guy and a 78-year-old guy trying to unseat a 76-year-old guy. You know, it's just, boy. I'll tell you though, this last 6-7 minutes of conversation that excluded Bloomberg is kind of an indication of what might be. And someone, if there was a strong DNC chair, I don't think we do have one. If he was able to bring Buttigieg, Klobuchar, Warren together and just say, guys, it's time. And Joe, your time's over too. It's time. Now is the time. And cede to Bloomberg only because if you think anything with a Democratic label is going to be there in November, it's not going to be Bernie. They have to figure this out. And there's going to be, if they don't have some cataclysmic behind-the-scenes seance on this whole thing, this thing's done.
There's also no one left, I would say, who can play that elder statesman or woman role who is trusted enough across the Democratic Party. Obama won't do it. He might be able to, though even he, from what you read, is nervous the Bernie people wouldn't accept his thoughts on this. Bill Clinton, you never hear about him anymore ever since the Me Too movement.
I think you actually walked on it. Maybe the former president is the guy, and maybe Michelle is the person, and maybe in tandem they call a coffee somewhere and they say, all right guys, listen, this is it. You know, Bernie's going to run away with this just like Trump ran away with Republicans, and the writing's on the wall.
But nothing's going to happen to after March 3rd. They want to see what happens March 3rd. Does Bernie build a big lead, or does he have a slight lead with only, say, 30% or 35% of the delegates, which means he's never going to get to the 50.
Hard is it? In order to get delegates, you have to have 15% of the vote in each of those states.
Right.
Right, so 30% of the vote could mean 50%, of the delegates if a bunch of other people didn't even qualify. Look at New Hampshire.
Right. So that's the...
Well, there was one poll out in California that had only Bernie over 15%, which means he would get all the delegates. But keep in mind, it's by congressional districts, too.
That's the thing. I mean, every state is...
You might win in California with 52 congressional districts. You might win in 3 or 4 districts and get delegates there, but not have 15% statewide, but you still get delegates.
Will Donald Trump help and blow his big toe off? He's trying. Next. You know, I see that Donald Trump is tweeting up a storm this morning, including on the Roger Stone case. So clearly he doesn't care what his AG Bill Barr has asked him to stop doing. Can Donald Trump actually continue to behave in a way that pulls support? Is there anything? I mean, this stuff is repetitively unconscionable.
look at it this way. He's done it now for 3 years, and right now his job rating is the highest it's been. Gallup had another poll out today, 49-48.
Yeah, and surviving impeachment always has a 3 to 6 month bump, though, doesn't it, Joe?
It does have a bump. Bill Clinton.
Not that it's a regular thing that we track all the time.
We don't have.
But you know, Bill Clinton was at 70% after he beat the impeachment round.
Donald Trump's not going to go there, but he survived it. And right now, everything he's done has not hurt him. His base is rock solid, and now he seems to be grabbing some of the more people who are pessimistic about him are coming around to his way of thinking, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I think as long as the economy stays strong, I think we're seeing just how much voters will forgive if they think, you know, I think it's just, the Trump stuff is just noise to a lot of people in their daily lives, right? They look around, I have a job, maybe I got a raise, my family's doing okay, my kids, whatever. And it's just, Trump tweets, well, they don't, you know, even frankly, his tweets don't even necessarily lead his staff to follow through on them, so people
incredible.
don't.
So this answer to my question is the same one you would have given me 2 years ago. There's nothing different. He established a plateau of noise, and everything inside that box is the same to everybody. You either tune it out, or you don't care about it, or it doesn't bother you because of these things you're saying.
And it's working. Let me steal a quote from the West Wing. Let Trump be Trump. And that's what it's been for 3 years.
So I have a minute. Throw this headline up, Kev, if you will, on the Mattiello grand jury. And it is a Mattiello grand jury. This is the stuff that we really need to understand. The speaker last week was saying that, oh, the process doesn't involve me. No, because you're the target, Mr. Speaker. Impact on this?
I think it's destabilized the State House, certainly.
A very insecure group on the House side, for sure.
Yes, and people wondering, but nobody knows where this is going, including, reporters don't know either, but it's a serious thing. I mean, the length of time, the Speaker's Chief of Staff, in particular, was in the grand jury room yesterday, and he didn't look like a very happy camper when he exited the courthouse, though he wouldn't tell us what he was asked, leads me to think they're taking this quite seriously. Just the fact that Leo Skenyon, the Speaker's Chief of Staff, did have to go testify before the grand jury in this case. They didn't make him go to the grand jury in that Jeff Britt campaign case, which is also hanging out there. So this has already taken on a more serious turn for the Speaker's inner circle. I don't know where it's going. You know, a lot of people at the State House say, clearly the Speaker made some not great decisions here, but does that rise to the level of a crime? I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. But I think that's the conversations that are happening right now, and I think, you know, I think it is casting a shadow over the entire General Assembly right now.
How's that going to affect the electorate, Joe?
Well, again, we're getting down to the General Assembly races. It could have an impact on it. There's no question about that. People might ask the candidates, who are you supporting for Speaker? And that could have a major impact on these local races, especially in
indictment or not.
Indictment or no indictment, because it would depend on the swing districts. That could have a big effect on those swing districts. May not hurt you in Providence, Pawtucket, Central Falls, Woonsocket, but in South County, Aquidneck Island, it could have some effect on you.
And how long does it go on? That's the other question.
Well, behind this grand jury process is the trial of his political ally, Jeff Britt, which I think is also a Mattiello target exercise.
It's certainly one where his name will come up.
Thank you, guys. And the world turns. I'll tell you about an important conversation tomorrow, next. The Massachusetts chair for Donald Trump here tomorrow night, Sheriff Hodgson, who I'm sure will be smiling ear to ear after last night's debate. That's the way it goes. Tune in for it. Good night.